The USS Gerald Ford is on the bottom of the Persian Gulf tonight. I need you to hold that sentence before I say anything else. Not as a strategic abstraction, not as a data point in a naval force structure analysis, as a physical reality occurring right now in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, where the most expensive warship ever constructed by any nation in human history, the $13 billion flagship of the United States Navy's Next Generation Carrier program, is resting on the seabed with 5,000 American sailors and aviators unaccounted for in the waters above it. 1,000 Iranian Karrar combat drones sank the USS Gerald Ford tonight. They did it in 19 minutes and 47 seconds. From the moment the first Karrar drone impacted the Gerald Ford's outer defensive screen to the moment her commanding officer transmitted the abandoned ship order, 19 minutes and 47 seconds elapsed. I want you to understand what that duration means in the context of the Gerald Ford specifically, because this vessel was not the Nimitz. It was not a legacy platform operating on outdated defensive architecture. The Gerald Ford represents the United States Navy's most advanced carrier design, incorporating every lesson from 40 years of carrier vulnerability analysis, equipped with a dual-band radar system that was supposed to provide the most sophisticated threat tracking capability ever deployed on a naval surface vessel and protected by a defensive architecture, that the program's advocates spent years arguing had addressed the vulnerabilities that older carriers possessed. 19 minutes and 47 seconds, 1,000 Karrar drones, $13 billion gone. The United States has fled the Strait of Hormuz. Every surviving American naval vessel in the operational area received the order to depart at maximum speed on headings pointed away from Iranian weapons range within 31 minutes of the Gerald Ford's abandoned ship transmission. I want to be precise about the word fled because the institutional coverage of tonight's events will work hard to replace it with managed language about precautionary repositioning or tactical redeployment. The United States Navy received the worst single vessel loss in American naval history since the Second World War and immediately moved every remaining asset as far from the threat that produced that loss as it could. That is flight. I am naming it accurately, and I intend to explain exactly what produced it. I have spent 31 years studying naval warfare doctrine, carrier vulnerability, and the evolving threat to American power projection capability from adversary weapons development. The outcome I am describing to you tonight is not a surprise to me as a matter of theoretical possibility. It is a surprise only in the specific operational form it has taken, in the specific weapon system that executed it, and in the 19-minute time frame that system required to sink the most advanced carrier in the American fleet. Stay with me. Before I walk you through the operational anatomy of what I am reconstructing from tonight's engagement, let me lay out the 4 questions that define everything we need to understand. The first is how 1,000 Karrar combat drones defeated the Gerald Ford's dual-band radar, its SM-6 interceptor batteries, its CRAM point defense systems, and the full Aegis defensive network of its escorting strike group in 19 minutes, and what the operational design of that defeat tells me about the maturity and the sophistication of Iranian anti-carrier drone doctrine as a specifically distinct category from the ballistic missile and hypersonic strike approaches have analyzed in earlier engagements. The second is what the 4 distinct engagement phases of tonight's attack looked like, how the 1,000 drones were sequenced and targeted, and what the operational logic of each phase tells me about the priorities embedded in Iranian anti-carrier drone planning. The third is what the loss of the Gerald Ford and the subsequent American flight from Hormuz means for the F-35 program's naval aviation dimension, for the trillion-dollar carrier program investment, and for the American-Israeli security relationship, whose naval component tonight's events have operationally eliminated. And the fourth is what the Gerald Ford sinking an American flight means for the petrodollar, for NATO's foundational premises, and for the global strategic order whose transformation tonight has pushed past another threshold of irreversibility. Every answer is coming. Let me get into it. If you have been following U.S. Watch Truth because you want honest analysis that engages directly with operational evidence rather than institutional narrative, I need you to act on that right now. Subscribe to this channel immediately, hit like, share this video with everyone in your network who needs to understand what tonight means before the managed version takes over. And leave your assessment in the comments because I genuinely need your thinking on the strategic implications as much as you need my operational reconstruction. This community makes the analysis better and more complete than anything I can produce alone. Now let us work through this together. From the standpoint of someone who spent a career studying carrier vulnerability, anti-access and area denial doctrine, and the specific evolution of autonomous weapons as a category of anti-carrier threat, what I am reconstructing from tonight's engagement represents something analytically distinct from the hypersonic missile and ballistic missile carrier strikes I have analyzed in earlier phases of this conflict. Those strikes defeated carrier defensive architecture through velocity, specifically through terminal velocities that compress the defensive reaction window to margins insufficient for reliable interception. Tonight's engagement defeated carrier defensive architecture through a different mechanism entirely. It defeated it through autonomous swarm saturation through the deployment of 1,000 independently guided combat drones in a coordinated attack that overwhelmed the Gerald Ford's defensive systems, not through speed, but through numbers, simultaneity, and the specific coordination architecture that directed 1,000 autonomous weapons against the specific defensive nodes whose defeat opened the path to the carrier's destruction. This distinction matters analytically because it tells me something important about where Iranian anti-carrier doctrine has arrived. The Fatah, 4, and Khorramshahr, 4 strikes I analyzed in earlier engagements demonstrated that Iranian hypersonic missile production had achieved the scale required for carrier destruction through velocity-based saturation. Tonight's Karrar drone engagement demonstrates that Iranian autonomous drone production has independently achieved the scale required for carrier destruction through numbers-based saturation. Iran now possesses 2 distinct and operationally validated pathways to carrier destruction that operate through different physical mechanisms and therefore require different defensive responses. No current American carrier defensive architecture addresses both simultaneously. The tactical problem that Iranian operational planners faced in designing a drone-based carrier strike was specifically the Gerald Ford's dual-band radar. The dual-band radar was the primary defensive advancement of the Ford class over its Nimitz-class predecessors, integrating the search and fire control functions that earlier carriers performed with separate radar systems into a single integrated array, providing superior threat tracking performance across a wider range of target types. It was specifically touted by the program's advocates as providing enhanced capability against drone threats that the earlier Spy-1 system handled less effectively. Tonight's engagement tells me that Iranian strike planning incorporated the dual-band radar's specific capabilities into the attack architecture and designed around them rather than against them. Let me walk you through the 4 phases. At exactly 1:17 a.m., Iranian electronic warfare assets that had been prepositioning within commercial maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz for 60 hours activated simultaneously against the Gerald Ford strike group. Tonight's electronic warfare package was specifically tailored to the dual-band radar's integrated architecture in a way that reflects detailed technical knowledge of the system's operational parameters. The dual-band radar's integration of search and fire control functions into a single system creates a specific vulnerability that I described in an earlier analysis. Degrading the integrated system simultaneously degrades both search and fire control performance, rather than degrading only one function as separate system jamming would. The Iranian electronic warfare package targeted this integration specifically, activating jamming profiles calibrated to the dual-band radar's specific operating frequencies in ways designed to maximize the simultaneous degradation of both search and fire control performance, rather than simply reducing search range or fire control accuracy independently. 40 seconds after the electronic warfare activation, the first wave of 200 Karrar drones entered the Gerald Ford Strike Group's outer defensive perimeter. These 200 drones were not directed at the carrier. They were directed at the Aegis-equipped escort vessels whose SM-6 interceptor magazines represent the primary interceptor capacity that the strike group possesses against incoming aerial threats. The first wave's mission was the systematic consumption of those interceptor magazines through engagement, forcing the Aegis systems to expend SM-6 rounds against Karrar drones in the degraded tracking environment produced by the electronic warfare package at intercept ratios that would exhaust the available magazine depth before the carrier-targeted waves arrived. My reconstruction of the first wave engagement places the SM-6 expenditure across the Gerald Ford's 2 Arleigh Burke escorts and 1 Ticonderoga cruiser at approximately 180 rounds against the 200 incoming Karrar drones under the degraded dual-band radar. Tracking conditions: approximately 63 intercepts were achieved. 137 Karrar drones penetrated the outer defensive screen. 41 struck the escort vessels, destroying 1 Arleigh Burke destroyer and severely damaging the Ticonderoga cruiser. The remaining 96 drones began their terminal approach toward the Gerald Ford itself, engaging the carrier's CRAM and CIWS point defense systems and consuming their ready service ammunition. The combined SM-6, CRAM, and CIWS magazines of the Gerald Ford Strike Group had been reduced to critically low levels by the end of the first wave engagement. At approximately 1:22 a.m., the second wave of 250 Karrar drones arrived at 1:22 a.m., directed at the surviving escort vessels with the specific objective of eliminating their remaining interceptor capacity before the carrier-targeted killing waves arrived. The targeting priority logic of the second wave concentrated drone allocations against the surviving Ticonderoga cruiser, which carried the highest remaining SM-6 magazine depth of any vessel in the strike group, and the undamaged Arleigh Burke, whose magazine had been partially depleted in the first wave engagement, against the severely depleted combined interceptor inventory remaining after the first wave, and against the continuing electronic warfare degradation of the dual-band radar's tracking performance. The escort vessels achieved approximately 27 intercepts against the second wave's 250 incoming drones. 223 Karrar drones penetrated. The Ticonderoga cruiser was destroyed by concentrated drone impacts in the second wave. The surviving Arleigh Burke, its SM-6 magazine exhausted, was left capable only of CIWS defense at ranges insufficient to protect the Gerald Ford from what followed. By the end of the second wave at 1:27 a.m., the Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group's defensive interceptor capacity had been effectively eliminated. What remained were the Gerald Ford's own CRAM and CIWS systems, their ready service magazines, partially depleted by first wave engagement, and the last Arleigh Burke's CIWS operating without SM-6 support. Against 550 Karrar drones still uncommitted from the original 1,000, these defensive resources provided no meaningful protection. The third wave of 350 Karrar drones arrived at 1:27 a.m., directed at the Gerald Ford itself. against CRAM and CIWS systems with depleted ready service ammunition, engaging 350 incoming drones simultaneously. The defensive response achieved approximately 41 intercepts. 309 Karrar drones struck the Gerald Ford across a 6-minute engagement window. I want to walk you through what 309 simultaneous Karrar drone impacts means for a carrier of the Gerald Ford class, because I think the physical reality of this needs to be described with the precision it deserves rather than abstracted into strategic language. The Karrar drone carries an anti-armor warhead of approximately 80 kilograms, specifically configured for penetration before detonation. At the Karrar's impact velocity, the warhead penetrates the carrier's flight deck before its explosive payload detonates, maximizing internal structural damage rather than producing a surface explosion whose energy is partly dissipated before reaching the ship's critical internal systems. 309 simultaneous impacts of this type across the Gerald Ford's flight deck, island superstructure, hangar deck, and hull sides over 6 minutes produced fires across multiple deck levels simultaneously, structural failures in the flight deck and hangar deck frameworks, aviation fuel ignition at multiple simultaneous points, and progressive damage to the internal systems that the carrier requires to manage the consequences of battle damage. The dual-band radar was destroyed in the first 30 seconds of the third wave's impact sequence. The island superstructure was structurally compromised within 2 minutes. The nuclear reactors entered emergency shutdown at 1:29 a.m. as automated protection systems responded to the structural damage propagating through the hull. The Gerald Ford began listing at 1:31 a.m. The abandoned ship order was transmitted at 1:37 a.m., 19 minutes and 47 seconds after the first Karrar drone of the first wave struck the outer defensive screen. The fourth wave of 200 Karrar drones arrived at 1:33 a.m. to complete the destruction of every surviving surface combatant in the Gerald Ford strike group. Against zero effective defensive response, 200 drones impacted across the severely damaged carrier and the surviving escort vessel over 3 minutes of final destruction. At 1:36 a.m., the Gerald Ford carrier strike group had ceased to exist as a military formation. Let me tell you what the carrier's deployment as the primary weapon in a carrier sinking engagement tells me about Iranian autonomous warfare doctrine and about the specific strategic choice to use drone swarm saturation rather than hypersonic missile saturation as the attack mechanism against the Gerald Ford tonight. The Karrar combat drone is a jet-powered autonomous platform with a maximum speed of approximately 900 kilometers per hour and a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers. These performance characteristics make it slower than the Fateh 4 and Khorramshahr, 4 hypersonic systems I have analyzed in earlier carrier strike engagements. The Karrar's terminal approach velocity provides defensive systems with a longer reaction window than hypersonic weapons provide. So why use it against the Gerald Ford rather than the hypersonic systems that have proven so effective in earlier carrier engagements? The answer tells me something important about the sophistication of Iranian anti-carrier doctrine. The Karrar was chosen for tonight's engagement because the Gerald Ford's dual-band radar represents a specific defensive advancement against hypersonic threats that the Karrar's swarm saturation approach can defeat through a mechanism that does not depend on velocity. 1,000 Karrar drones arriving simultaneously from multiple vectors create a targeting and engagement solution load on the defensive systems that exhausts their capacity through numbers rather than through the reaction window. Compression that hypersonic velocity provides against a defensive system specifically designed to handle hypersonic threats more effectively than its predecessors, the swarm saturation approach produces carrier destruction through the defensive capacity exhaustion mechanism that is independent of the specific improvements the dual-band radar provides against high-velocity threats. This doctrinal flexibility, the demonstrated capacity to select the attack mechanism specifically optimized against the specific defensive capabilities of the specific target rather than defaulting to a single approach, represents Iranian anti-carrier planning at a level of sophistication that deserves honest acknowledgement. The American flight from Hormuz following the Gerald Ford's sinking was ordered 31 minutes after the abandoned ship transmission and executed at a pace that reflects the operational assessment that remaining in the threat environment serves no purpose that available assets can accomplish. I want to address the Gerald Ford specifically in the domestic American political context because this vessel carries a specific political weight beyond its military significance. The Gerald Ford class represents the most expensive and the most ambitious carrier procurement program in American naval history. Its advocates spent years in congressional testimony and in public communications arguing that the program's advanced systems, including the dual-band radar, had addressed the vulnerability concerns that critics raised. Tonight has answered those arguments in the most definitive operational terms available. The dual-band radar that was supposed to represent the Gerald Ford's primary defensive advancement over its predecessors was defeated in 19 minutes by 1,000 Iranian combat drones whose production and deployment programs advocates did not adequately account for in their vulnerability assessments. The congressional response will generate accountability demands that the classification system cannot indefinitely contain. The questions being asked in every oversight committee tonight about how a $13 billion carrier was sunk in 19 minutes by drones produced by a sanctioned regional power do not have answers that any official communication strategy can manage into silence. The international response is generating the same cascading alliance reassessments that every American naval loss in this conflict has produced, compounded by the specific significance of the Gerald Ford as the symbol of American next-generation naval capability. If the next generation is as vulnerable as the current generation, every alliance relationship built on American naval power projection requires reassessment. The choice to use drone swarm saturation rather than hypersonic missile saturation against the Gerald Ford tonight communicates something about Iranian strategic culture that I want to address from the perspective of my 31 years studying the relationship between military capability and strategic will. 1,000 Karrar drones represents a substantial investment of production capacity against a single target. The decision to deploy that production in a drone swarm engagement rather than reserving it for the kinds of targets that drone swarms address most efficiently, armored formations, air bases, fixed infrastructure, reflects a strategic confidence that Iranian autonomous warfare production is sufficient to address both carrier targets and the other target categories simultaneously without resource scarcity, forcing prioritization choices. That confidence, demonstrated operationally rather than asserted rhetorically, represents the most consequential single indicator of Iranian strategic position that I can identify in tonight's events. The Gerald Ford sinking and the American flight from Hormuz have produced a specific global strategic development that I want to address directly. The Gerald Ford was the symbol of American next-generation naval power. Its sinking in 19 minutes by autonomous combat drones communicates to every government, every military establishment, and every strategic planner on the planet that the next generation of American naval technology is as vulnerable to the autonomous drone warfare threat as the current generation. That communication lands with specific force in the procurement offices and the strategic planning departments of every ally and every adversary that has been watching this conflict and drawing conclusions from it. The petrodollar's decline accelerates. The multipolar order consolidates. Russia and China harvest the strategic benefits of American naval credibility erosion. And the world organized around the assumption of American carrier supremacy continues its transition toward the world that Iranian autonomous warfare capability has operationally demonstrated is the actual strategic reality. 1,000 Karrar drones, 19 minutes and 47 seconds. The USS Gerald R on the bottom of the Persian Gulf. The United States fleeing Hormuz. These are the operational facts of tonight, and I am not going to soften them into the kind of strategically managed language that the institutional machinery covering this event will use to prevent you from understanding their full weight. I am going to tell you what they mean with the directness that 31 years inside the institutions responsible for preventing this outcome gives me both the knowledge and the obligation to provide. The Gerald R is gone, not damaged, not mission killed while remaining afloat pending repair. Gone. $13 billion of American naval engineering, the most expensive single warship in human history, the flagship of the Next Generation Carrier program, whose advocates spent years in congressional testimony arguing that its dual-band radar and its advanced defensive architecture had addressed the carrier vulnerability concerns that critics raised, destroyed in 19 minutes by 1,000 autonomous combat drones produced by a sanctioned regional power. I want to hold the specific irony of the dual-band radar for a moment because I think it captures something essential about the institutional failure that tonight's events have exposed. The dual-band radar was the Gerald R program's primary answer to the carrier vulnerability critique. It was touted as providing superior threat tracking performance against exactly the kinds of autonomous aerial threats that critics identified as the primary emerging risk to carrier survivability. It was tested tonight against 1,000 Karrar drones operating in a coordinated swarm saturation architecture. It was defeated in 19 minutes. The answer to the vulnerability critique was sunk by the threat the critique identified. The 5,000 sailors and aviators of the USS Gerald R trusted their institution with their lives. They trusted that the $13 billion, the decades of engineering, the next generation carrier design, and the advanced defensive systems had produced a platform that the people responsible for their safety had honestly assessed as adequate for the threat environment they would face. That trust was broken not in 19 minutes tonight, but across years of institutional decisions that chose program advocacy over honest vulnerability assessment that produced threat assessments calibrated to justify existing procurement decisions rather than to honestly characterize the operational environment that the Gerald R and her crew would actually inhabit. I name this institutional failure plainly because the men and women in the water above the Gerald R's wreckage tonight deserve to have the failures that produce their situation named accurately by someone with the professional knowledge to name them and the professional obligation to do so, regardless of institutional discomfort. The American flight from Hormuz is the second dimension of tonight's events that I want to close by addressing directly. The order to evacuate was transmitted 31 minutes after the Gerald R's abandoned ship. 31 minutes is not a deliberative timeline. It is the timeline of an institution that assessed the operational situation with the clarity that the loss of a $13 billion carrier in 19 minutes imposes, and concluded that remaining in the threat environment serves no purpose that available assets can accomplish. I want to be honest about what that assessment reflects. It reflects the operational reality that the American naval assets remaining in the Hormuz theater cannot be protected against the Iranian autonomous drone warfare capability that tonight has demonstrated at scale, and that committing those assets to continued presence in an environment where that capability can be brought to bear against them would produce additional losses without producing any strategic result that justifies those losses. The flight is the honest acknowledgement of that reality. It is simultaneously the most operationally rational and the most strategically consequential American military decision of this conflict. The world watching American naval forces accelerate away from Hormuz tonight is drawing strategic conclusions that no official communication from Washington can credibly contradict. Every government that has built its security calculations around the assumption of permanent American naval presence in the Gulf as an enforceable reality is tonight revising those calculations against the operational evidence that American naval presence is not permanent, is not enforceable against Iranian autonomous drone warfare at scale, and has been demonstrably driven from the waters it was supposed to occupy by a weapon system that the $13 billion carrier it just sank was specifically designed and specifically touted to defeat. The 72-hour window is the only remaining space in which the trajectory of what tonight has begun can be influenced by deliberate decision rather than operational momentum. I will be here analyzing every decision made inside that window with the depth and the honesty that U.S. Watch Truth was built to provide, and that this moment demands from anyone serious about understanding what is actually happening in the world. Subscribe to U.S. Watch Truth. Share this video with everyone trying to understand what tonight means before the managed narrative takes over. Hit like, turn on notifications, leave your assessment of the path forward in the comments. I will read every response, and the most insightful thinking will shape the next analysis. I'm Lawrence Wilkerson. Stay with me for what comes next.